I don't think we met before, but I'm the referee on this field.
Leinster could offer me $5 million a year, I wouldn't go.
It is Tommy Moore!
Rugby Weekly.
In the first pass. Magic!
You're not alive, boy, so you start kicking when the room is spinning and the words aren't sticking.
Hello and a very warm welcome to the 42 Rugby Weekly. Gavan Casey here in the hot seat. Murray Kinsella remains on well-earned leave, so delighted to be joined on the podcast by Garry Doyle, my fellow colleague with 42. Gary, how are you? Quiet day, I'd say.
Great day. Yeah, I love this, I guess, Gav. There's plenty to keep us busy. Certainly there's plenty to talk about. And great to be back on the pod, Gav. A surprise inclusion along with all the guys that have made it into Gats' squad today as well.
No, don't have yourself down as a bolter, Gary. You were always going to be here. There was an air of inevitability about your inclusion this week. Bernard Jackman joins us as always. Stalwart. Bernard, how are you and how's your day been going? I'd say it's been fairly mad, has it?
Yeah, it's been good. It's been busy. Lions tour coincided with my lunch break, so I thought I dragged it out longer than was necessary. But look, it's great to have a bunch of players to talk about now and deliberate over who's lucky and unlucky. So I'm sure we're gonna give a due process on that.
Yeah, 100%. We'll get into the Lions stuff, have a chat with the two lads. We're going to chat as well about the somewhat more disappointing action over the weekend, just gone. And then Bernard and I will circle back for a bit more Lions chat for the 42 members as well. We'll field a few of your questions in a separate members pod, members.the42.ie if you want to get that extra pod. But let's kick off with some of that Lions chat now. And Bernard, I'll start with yourself. Some of those surprise inclusions, Bundy Aki, would have been, I'd say, unexpected by most in Ireland and probably by most outside of Ireland as well. And then, 3-4 players who can consider themselves unfortunate to miss out. Particularly, I guess, the headline exclusion from an Irish point of view being Johnny Sexton.
Yeah, I think Sexton is unlucky. Obviously, not being fit the last couple of games and having some injuries during the Six Nations as well. I'm sure it went against him, but definitely unlucky. I think if you want to have a real driving force alongside Alan Wynne-Jones in terms of a leadership group, he's someone who could have added a lot of value. So yeah, disappointed for him. And, you know, James Ryan, obviously, and Gary Ringrose are two other high-profile ones. But I think both of them are a little bit out of form. And that's down to probably not getting a good run with of games. Obviously, James Ryan's had some concussion issues. And Ringrose obviously had that facial injury that slowed him down a little bit. So I can understand, but you know, both those two. But they'll be bitterly disappointed. I mean, you know, a year ago, you would have said they were shoe-ins and people were saying James Ryan, who would partner James Ryan in the second row, but he's just missed out due to, I think, probably a couple of injuries and maybe, you know, not hitting top form quickly. Obviously, the most recent two games are La Rochelle and Munster where he looked a little bit undercooked. So, yeah, tough on him.
It is, yeah. Gary, to focus on Sexton for a moment, you could absolutely, as Bernard says, put the exclusions of Ringrose and Ryan down to form, and it's a loss of form on the back of a couple of injuries that has sort of debilitated them or knocked them out of stride, really. And sometimes it just takes that little bit longer to rediscover that flow to what you're doing on a weekly basis. But Sexton had form. It's really just down to injury, isn't it? Like, he was arguably the form out half of the Six Nations, even though he did miss some of it through injury. He was unbelievable against England, probably his best test since 2018. He kicked Ireland a victory against Scotland, so he can feel rightly aggrieved, I'd say, even though the selection overall in the circumstances is probably somewhat understandable because he hasn't played recently.
Absolutely. I agree with every point you've made there, Gav. Like, let's take the first point there. You're talking about what he did in the Six Nations. He landed 86% of his shots at goal, which is a higher percentage than any other player in the tournament. So you look at that, and then you add in the other factors that he brings: his desire to win, his tactical intelligence, his defensive strength, which is, let's face it, much better than most fly halves in the world. So when you add all those factors together, and then you think back to the 2017 tour, which turned on the back of his inclusion for the second test, you're basically wondering why he didn't make it. Now, there are a couple of reasons why he didn't. If you look at his injury profile this year, he's made 5 starts for Leinster, and he's come off hurt in 4 of those. The latest of those being the game against Exeter in the quarterfinals. On the back of that, he wasn't there on Sunday when Leinster really need them against La Rochelle. So at 35, he'll turn 36 in a couple of months. His durability must have been a concern for Gatland, and that must have been the key reason why he didn't make the squad. But in addition to that, you've got really good players who did make the squad. And when you look right across the names that Gatland has gone with, you're looking at, in my view, the toughest selection a Lions coach has had since 1989, on the basis that you've got 4 teams of equal or near enough equal ability, which hasn't been the case since the 89 Tour de Australia. So in the 90s, Ireland were rubbish, so it made it really easier to just exclude so many players. Like, we had only 2 tourists on the 93 tour, with only 4 in 97. When Ireland got better, Scotland took our place as the crappy team. So again, it was really easy to ignore the Scots. There were no more than 3 Scots on any touring party in this century until this one. And then today, you've got the breakdown of 11 English, 10 Welsh, 8 Scots, 8 Irish. Gatland said he was looking at 57 players. So when you put all that into the mix, Gav, you can see why it was so hard for him to come up with the squad that he did. And he even extended from 36 to 37. So, I'm not going to go as far as to say I've got sympathy for him, but I can certainly see that it was a tough call. And there were a lot of tough calls that he had to make. Like in England, the big call over there the big headline over there is the fact that Kyle Sinclair didn't make it. And Sinclair came off the bench in all 3 tests on the 2017 tour, and he's played more minutes than any other prop since the start of 2020 in international rugby. And he ranked first for tackles and second for carries amongst props in that period. So I mean, that's a big decision as well. It's not purely the Irish guys who are unlucky to miss out. There's a number of players who are unlucky.
No, for certain. And even if we were saying that James Ryan, quite rightly saying, I think James Ryan is unfortunate himself to miss out. If you can put his exclusion down to form, as we've said, you could argue CJ Sander, I think, is actually very unfortunate to miss out, because he was in reasonably good form and has been consistently for the last number of years. He kind of doesn't seem to be figuring in that conversation so much as Ryan and even Ringrose, but I would have him up there as one of the more higher profile Irish guys who could be looking at it, feeling a little bit disappointed for themselves as well, Gar.
I just wonder, the fact that the tour's in South Africa and the fact that Stander's going back there, Gav, is that an easy option for Gatland to sort of be able to say, if there's an injury, that he could call him in? I'm just wondering if that's a case. And it's possibly a case. The other factor, again, is just how strong the options are. But in terms of, is he a player in form? Again, and I hate to be a complete bore with stats, but seeing as I've done them, I might as well put them out there. He has topped the rankings for carries in 4 of the past 5 Nations Championships, and he has made more post-contact meters than any other forward in this year's championship. So yes, he is a guy in form, and he is very unlucky not to be there.
Gary mentions, Bernard, that he wouldn't go as far as to say he has sympathy for Gatland over the difficulty of this selection. You know Johnny Sexton and the kind of person he is, the kind of competitor he is. Do you think he will feel in some ways let down by Gatland, in the sense that, as Gary pointed out and as everybody saw in 2017, he helped to salvage a tour from the wreckage, really, in his inclusion then, and he does seem to be a guy who appreciates loyalty, certainly within a playing squad as a leader. So do you think he would have expected something along those lines from Gatland, or would he have been more realistic about it given his injuries in very recent times?
Yeah, look, I think he obviously would have. He obviously hoped he'd get in, and past success would have carried weight. I think it's a big mistake to bring Finn Russell ahead of Johnny Sexton, even with Johnny having some injuries and injury concerns about him. I think if Finn Russell ends up being our starting test line 10, we're dead. I just think the way South Africa defend he will run into all kinds of trouble and put others into trouble as well. So I don't see the logic in bringing Finn Russell ahead of him. And yeah, so I do feel sorry for Johnny in this situation. But I totally think it's down to maybe worries about his durability, and it's just really unfortunate that he's had these couple of knocks recently. Obviously, having to go off early against Exeter, there would have been eyes on him in that game. It's interesting. Neil Jenkins spoke about he's never seen him kick as well as he has this season. It must be very close. And knowing Johnny, he'll feel sorry for himself for about 24 hours, and then he'll look to regroup and try and, I suppose, play as much as he can over the next month and a half. And I'm sure he'll be one of those players on standby, and he could yet have a role to play, but it'll be a difficult thing to follow. I mean, he would want to be on this tour, and he'd want to be part of helping the Lions, win a series in South Africa. So it's difficult, but I do think the Finn Russell one is it's a mistake in terms of picking him over Johnny.
One last one on 10. I don't want to make it an entirely Sexton adjacent or related conversation. Just to stick with yourself, Birch, if you think that bringing Russell over Sexton is a mistake, and we're talking about form dictating a lot of this, is bringing Owen Farrell a mistake? He has no form to speak of. Or, I'll correct myself, he actually has pretty bad form, really, to speak of at the moment.
Yeah, he hasn't been playing. He didn't play well for England, but England didn't play well in the Six Nations, and there's reasons why. Gatland still has gone with 6 or 5 Saracens players, so they've been playing the championship. He's given them a credibility based on their past performances, and I actually don't have any issue with any of those Saracens players playing. I don't have any issue with Owen Farrell going. I think we know what he brings. He's very like Sexton in terms of being a driver of things off field, and I think the difference by the time the Lions tour comes around is he'll have been playing rugby every week. Okay, you can argue the toss about the level of it, but it'll be at least be game time, and I would expect him to bounce back as the likes of Elliot Daly will and Atoje, etc. So I wouldn't have concerns about Farrell, at all.
Gary, you're a man whose phone book is bulging to the point that it's actually protruding from your screen there. So had you any idea, or had you caught wind at all, that Bundy Aki would be that surprise inclusion?
No, not at all. I'd say Bundy Aki was as surprised as everyone else. That's the biggest call from an Irish perspective of the guys that are travelling. Like, I just didn't see that come at all. I mean, would you put him, if you were naming the Irish team tomorrow, would you put him in it?
Not personally, but that's not to say he's not an excellent player.
Yeah, no, he was an excellent player. I don't think he has been excellent this season. Injuries have certainly have affected him. He's had a suspension to serve as well. He hasn't played as well this year as he has the last 3-4 years for Ireland. But nonetheless, he can still. The funny thing is, even though having just been critical of him, you can still see the logic in why he's been selected, because firstly, he's a big game player. Secondly, his confidence is ironclad, no matter how poor his form is. And thirdly, he's a physical presence, which you're going to need against South Africa. So I can see the logic in why he is gone, but it is one that I certainly wasn't anticipating.
Birch, can you see the logic on Aki's inclusion?
Yeah, I think historically he's gone for that big physical 12 all the way through his career, whether it's Jamie Roberts or everywhere he's been, Waikato, etc. So I can think, obviously Robbie Henshaw's in great form, and I'd imagine he will be ahead of Bundy as a 12, but I think Bundy gives him that profile that he likes to have as a go-to. And obviously with Manu Tuilagi out with injury, there was a lot of rumours maybe Manu was going to be a wild card and just pick him now and in the hope that he becomes true. But Gats hasn't taken that risk, and he's gone for Bundy as that type of player. So the thing about Bundy is, and it's brilliant for Connacht, it's brilliant for him, is he has a different profile than all the other centres that Gats has picked. And I think that's a smart thing. But also Gats has gone for that type of 12 a lot over his career. So yeah, I think that's probably why he's in.
Who would you actually anticipate playing at 13 looking at that squad, Bert?
It's a really interesting one. I'm not sure. Like Chris Harris, for me, it's a big call. I know he had a good tournament. I'm actually thinking that he might go Bundy and Robbie. Is Robbie 13?
Or possibly he might go Farrell at 12 and Henshaw 13.
Farrell at 12. Yeah, he might go Farrell at 12, but that would be, yeah, he might do that as well. But then, yeah, I don't know. I think he'll go for size and defensive strength, and for me that would be Farrell at 10, and then at 2. I know Farrell plays 12. Has played 12 quite a lot, but I would go for 2 bigger centres. So yeah, Bunny might come in as a starting 12 with Robbie at 13.
Some other key inclusions from an Irish point of view, guys that I guess all Irish rugby fans were hoping would be included based on form, based on having very good seasons. I'm thinking of Tyg Byrne, Ian Henderson, Andrew Porter's in there. We kind of suspected, obviously, Tyg Furlong would be in there. Who am I missing out? Jack Conan, another big one. Like his recent kind of, not resurgence, but recent...
No, resurgence is a good enough word, because he had a terrible luck with injury, Gav, and he didn't come into the Six Nations squad as a starter until midway through the campaign. And I think the key moment that turned Ireland's season, and it also turned people's perception of Conan, was that throw from Hurricane in the line-out against England. Like, England were dominant in that Six Nations test right up until that moment, and that was the moment that turned the game. And a mixture of Conan's footwork, his athleticism, I can say that word comfortably, and his handling skills to take that ball to tail at the line and then drop it perfectly into Keith Earls' pass as he arrived into the gap that Conan had created. That for me is the time when Gatland says, no, this guy can execute a game plan perfectly, transfer it from the training ground onto the pitch, do it in a big time environment, and obviously it's the one moment that stands out, but it's backed up by a number of really, really good performances. And I think Gatland has looked at his back row and he's decided he needs a bit of variety, needs a bit of pace and a bit of skill. And there's absolutely no doubt that Conan is a really, really clever footballer and a really talented player. And also, he's not a kid anymore. He's 28. And while it's been a bit of a disaster for him to have such career-damaging injuries, the fact is now that he's really fresh coming into this Lions summer. And that's, again, a big, big factor, because there are going to be a number of players that are going to hit the wall, given that pre-season training started last July. So they're going to be in their 12th, 13th month of the season. Whereas with Conan, he's been fresh until December. He's come into form, and I know it's not particularly in England and in Wales and Scotland, they're probably looking at this inclusion and going, well, why is he on the plane? But I think it's a really, really smart call and a really brave call by Gatland, particularly because Billy Vunipola isn't going. That's extraordinary to think that.
Certainly is. We will circle back to Lions chat, as I said, for the 42 members later on. Birch and I will stick around. But Gary, while we have you, I want to chat Ulster, and with a native Ulster man, and I would say an irate Ulster man after the weekend just gone.
Is there any other kind than an irate Ulster man?
Passionate, I should have said. Passionate.
If there is, let me know. Having lived there so long.
Go on then. I'll let you off the leash. What did you make of it? What was your kind of immediate reaction, and what is your reaction a few days later when you've had a chance to give it more thought and process it?
Yeah, it sort of sums up the last 10 years of Ulster's recent history. The game was in, I wouldn't say the game was in the bag, but they were certainly in control of the game. And there were 3 moments in the second half, Gav, which kind of sums up Ulster in big matches. You had Robert Balakoon spilling the ball around the halfway line and then getting smothered as he sought to regather it. That was a penalty to Leicester. They scored 7 points off that. Ian Henderson gave away a needless penalty at the ruck, again around halfway. Again, Leicester score. And then Albie Matheson put the ball out in the full just after Ulster had scored a try through Timney to get back into it. So those three moments led to 17 points to Leicester. Ulster lose by 9. Now, again, without being a complete bore, if you go back through Ulster's recent history over the last 10 years, you're looking at 5 quarterfinals in the Heineken Cup that they've lost. You're looking at the semi-finals of the Challenge Cup. Then last year, the final of the Pro 14. These add up, and you begin to wonder: is it a psychological issue? Because if you continue to lose big games, yet your regular season record is really impressive. Like Ulster won 14 out of 16 matches in the Pro 14 this season. So they're clearly a team that's moving in the right direction. But when you're losing big matches, the question has to be why. And really, like their match tomorrow is it's must win, even though it's only the second game of the campaign, because it's only a 6-game regular season tournament in the Rainbow Cup. If you lose for a second time, that's it. It's over, And there's just the big word, if you were an Ulster supporter, that you must be feeling after that game is frustration, because the first half they played really, really well, and there's absolutely no doubt that the team is in a much better place than it was on the back of Dan McFarlane's work and since he came in, they've become much better. They've become much fitter. They've become much more consistent, but they're still losing semi-finals, and they're still losing these tight matches. And the other thing, the final point I'd like to make is that they've lost 6 games this season. Twice to Leinster in the Pro 14, once to Connacht in the Rainbow Cup. They lost to Toulouse and Gloucester in the Champions Cup, and then the Leicester defeat. In all 6 games, they had the lead at some point of those matches. So, you can say, right, that's just a meaningless stat. But after a while, when you keep losing big matches, it's not meaningless, and it's probably meaningful. So, they say they had a harsh review and honest words were spoken, but people don't want to hear that anymore. They want to see that difference, those words turn into actions on the pitch.
Yeah, Birch, we were saying beforehand, we'll have a kind of a bigger picture chat about the 2 European games. We don't necessarily have to go into the several incidents from each, but just to pick up on Gary's final point there about Ulster having leads and surrendering them, that this was a very dramatic and accentuated example of that phenomenon, if you like. And it did seem as though there was a change in mindset, or maybe a change literally in strategy in that second half. They clearly kicked the ball more. They didn't kick it well, which cost them. But I wondered, and I tried to ask Stephen Ferris this on the members pod earlier in the week. I probably made a balls of my question. Here I go again. But I wonder, with that switch, if you think it happened, when you are kicking contestables and playing that little bit more conservatively, if somewhere subconsciously you cede a little bit of the physical control you had on the game as well, like by playing conservatively with ball, do you lose a small bit of that edge that they had in the first half? Because we saw probably their line speed slow down that little bit in the second half, and we just saw Leicester get on top of them physically. And I wonder, was there a causal connection between the two?
Yeah, I don't know if it's mental, or are they just lacking that quality, to be honest. It goes back for me when they came to the Aviva to play Leinster. I'm not sure if it was a semi-final or quarter-final.
Quarter-final,
Quarter-final, and the game, they actually had a chance of beating Leinster, which would have been a phenomenal victory, because they came in as massive underdogs. McFarland and his coaching staff designed, you'd say the perfect game plan, and yet they found a way. Everyone praised Leinster for finding a way to win, and they deserve credit for that. But Ulster, for me, found a way to lose, and since then I've just seen them fall at the big hurdles. So whether that's losing to Toulouse at home, in the Champions Cup, in the early stage this year, obviously, they didn't. They had a chance to get ahead of Leinster and knock Leinster out at the end of the Pro 14, Pro 14 just a couple of months ago, because Leinster lost to Connacht. Ulster actually had a chance to get ahead of them and be in a final against Munster without even having to beat Leinster if they had picked up enough bonus points, and they managed to blow that. So I don't know if it's psychological. Obviously, they've come from a very dark place. Obviously, around the time John O'Gibbs was there, their form dropped off massively, and there is progress. But I don't I think we can read too much into their form in the Pro 14 in terms of them being a top 2 team or a top 4 team, because we know that doesn't really match up to probably the upper levels in the Gallagher Premiership or the top 14. And like the problem is Leicester aren't a top 3 team at the moment in England. They're definitely on the way back, and I fancy them because I thought they had, a strong scrum, they were physical, and they had a good maul, and that was going to be enough to beat Ulster. But they're certainly not a Bristol, an Exeter, or Saracens when they get back into it. And yeah, so it is worrying for them. I mean, the problem is now Marcel Coetzee is gone, and the replacement for him is Nakawara, who's a bit of a punt for me. He's gone backwards. Obviously, the Nakawara that went to Racing and was part of an Olympic Sevens team is a different story than the one we're seeing now for struggling to make the team in Glasgow. So, maybe he's not going to be as influential as Marcel has been. Okay, there's some good young players coming through, but I thought Ferris's interview actually was, look, it's harsh, but I agree with a huge amount of it in terms of maybe lacking identity. And it probably feeds into the whole, where we're going to go with Leinster and Irish rugby. I think where I'm going to go anyway is that if the other provinces are just getting players, not all the players, but if they're getting 4 or 5 players in their starting team who can make the Leinster team, unless Leinster are doing a very bad job coaching them, or there's been an injury, or you've improved their S&C, it's very difficult to see how they're going to then pass out Leinster, which is what they all should be trying to do. And if you can't pass out Leinster and you're not getting closer to them, are you good enough to go and win trophies elsewhere? Probably not, because Leinster aren't winning trophies elsewhere. So that's the challenge for me, is that they do, there's probably not the same identity in Munster or Ulster as there was in the past. Maybe that's just modern rugby. But at the moment, it's not getting Ulster where they want to go and their fans want to go, and that's been successful. And I think that this Challenge Cup was a phenomenal opportunity, because they're probably not going to be back in the Challenge Cup for a while because of the quality of the Pro 14. They're always going to be qualifying for Champions Cup. So it was just a great chance to win a silverware. And they're probably not going to win silverware in the Pro 14 because they're not as good as Leinster. So, I think for Dan McFarland, for the players and for the fans, they'll definitely feel this was a big opportunity.
Can I bring you in, Gary, on the word identity, which I know infuriates a lot of people? I do think it has a relevance. I saw when Ferris brought it up, he listed, say, an Ulster pack minus Ian Henderson, a likely starting pack minus Ian Henderson, and all of those players would have been, say, recruited, some of them Irish, but they're, say, non-academy products. The same with the starting halfbacks, and that's where he brought identity into it. And I understand that, particularly in the modern era, people's bone of contention with that would be, well, what does it matter where your player is born, or what does it really matter if the players are actually good? That's fair enough, but I think it's indisputable that it does help, particularly in the provinces, if you have a strong contingent of players who have come up through the province and who know what it kind of means to play for the province, and have that relationship with fans because they were themselves at a point fans of that same team. It's not that it can't work if you're recruiting players from all over the place. We look at La Rochelle, look at some of the French clubs, but of course if you have a cohort, like a strong nucleus of players who know the province inside out, it is of benefit. I don't think that can be disputed, can it?
No, but Ulster do have a lot of players that were born and bred in Ulster who are playing for them, like Mikey Lowry, McCluskey, Balakoon, Stockdale. You go through, Tom O'Toole isn't from Ulster, but he moved to Ulster when he was 16, so he came through the system. You go through, you're thinking of other players like Kyle McCall, who's in the squad as well. Identity's a strange one, okay? And particularly for Ulster rugby, because when I was growing up, there was the sense that Ulster was Ulster rugby was for prodigies only, and if you weren't a prod, you didn't support Ulster. I think that's changed completely in the last 20 years. I think Ulster as a place has changed in the last 20 years. Anytime I go back up home, you don't get the sense of them and us that you would have had when I was growing up, and you knew which streets to walk down and which towns to avoid when I was growing up. You don't get that. Still exists to an extent, but there's a lot more basically cross-community support for the Ulster team now. So in the 1980s, what people forget is that before Munster had their phenomenal run, and before Leinster replaced Munster as the top team in Ireland, when I was growing up, Ulster by a distance was the top province. In '84, when the Aussies won their Grand Slam, they beat the four home nations, but the word around Ulster was they lost the fifth nation because they lost Ulster 15-13 on that tour. And that was a phenomenal Wallabies team in '84. Munster didn't beat Ulster from 81 to 94. Now, I'll stand corrected on that, but more or less, there was 10. Ulster won 10 interpros in a row. So nobody can doubt that they had an identity then. I still think they have a really strong identity. I still think they play with an incredible amount of pride, and it doesn't come down to your birthplace, it comes down to your attitude, in my view. And I think the attitude of every Ulster player when they play for Ulster is really impressive. But I think what's really unimpressive is their inability to see out winning positions. They were 10 points up in Gloucester on 65 minutes, and they lost. They were leading against Connacht by 10 points, and Connacht were down to 14 men, and Ulster lost. They were leading at half-time by 11 points against Leicester, and they lost. And they were leading against Toulouse in the second half of that game, and they lost. And again, we'll go back to the earlier matches against Leinster. They were leading both times, and they lost. The match that Birch was referencing, the game in I think it was the 2019 quarterfinal against Leinster in the Aviva. That was when Stockdale failed to ground the ball in the end goal area. That's a lack of ruthlessness. I think that's the issue. Having said that, I'm not living there anymore, whereas Stephen Ferris is closer to the squad and is living in Belfast, so he would have a stronger sense of how people feel. But I did do a piece on this a couple of years ago, and I spoke to the chairman of the Ulster Supporters Club, and his view was that it comes down to how these players behave, the attitude they show, and the desire they show. And I don't think there's a lack of desire in the Ulster team. Maybe there is a lack of quality, but they've also been unlucky. They've also been unlucky, Gav, in the sense that Coetzee has been there 5 years, but he only played 57 times because he was injured. Carter has been there 2 years, and he's only played 1,062 minutes. So that they're factors as well. They needed those guys in those big matches.
Yeah, just to come in on that, when I was talking about identity, sorry, I didn't explain myself well. I definitely wasn't talking about religion, and I wasn't trying to be just focus on Ulster. I was trying to talk about the macro of Irish rugby, and my point is that Leinster at the moment, the reason Leinster are strong, in my opinion, is there's a very competitive environment because of player numbers, because of private schools, because of youths, etc., to get into the academy. Right, there's a funnel. So you've all these 15, 16, 17, 18-year-olds fight to get into the academy, okay? And it's very difficult. Once you get into that academy, obviously you got to push through to become a senior player. And because Leinster have so many Irish internationals, they play a lot of players, and they play with other good players, so they look really good, and they're playing against teams who are inferior to them, so they look brilliant, right? So you have a very good chance then of actually being a professional rugby player, right? And once you become a professional rugby player in Leinster, you're probably going to be a professional player in Ireland for the rest of your career. That's the trend at the moment. Okay, you don't make it in Leinster, you're going to get picked up by Munster, Ulster, or Connacht and have a professional career. My point is that competition generally creates diamonds. Pressure creates diamonds, and unfortunately, at the moment, because Ulster aren't producing enough players, Munster aren't producing enough players. And Connacht are a little bit different in terms of traditionally they've always tapped into the Leinster players, but they're fighting to try and make sure they produce their own players as well. That the deal scenario for me is, in terms of making the Irish teams better, is that if you can't make it in your own province, that it's highly likely you're going to get a contract somewhere else because there's enough players coming through your own pathway, right? So I'm not saying that those players who leave Leinster aren't entitled to have a professional career. But imagine they weren't able to get into Ulster because Ulster was already so strong, right? And they went to play in Brian Burns' example, playing for Bristol every week and doing brilliantly well, right? So in theory, he can play 20 games a year for Bristol and come back to Leinster a better player, right? So he's still in our talent pool. We got an extra spot. The problem at the moment is that when a player moves from Leinster and he goes to Munster, Ulster, or Connacht, well, we know that he's probably not going to be in international, right? Because he's left because of game time. Or I know there's guys like Conway who've managed to do both. But in general, that they're going to go to another province and take up game time there. But yet they're not going to actually help Ireland win games because they're not that level, and then they're not going to help the provinces they go to. Sorry, they're trying to help, but it's unlikely they're going to help them get better than Leinster, which is obviously what they need to try and do. So that's my issue that's what I meant in terms of identity. I think it's better if the 4 provinces are all producing enough talent that it's not just a case of, oh, we need another lock, who's 5th choice in Leinster, ring up David Nusafora and ask can they get him. But that's, for me, that they're never going to catch up. And Ireland by extenuation of that, aren't going to have those X factor players, those match winner players that we see at this level. We see at this level in knockout stage, whether it's Montpellier against Bath, whether it's Leicester against Ulster, La Rochelle against Leinster. Those type of players who can help you win games are unlikely to come from players who are let go by Leinster, because if they're good enough to win games, Leinster won't let them go. Do you know what I mean? And that's my issue about identity, is that we're moving players from Leinster, and it's great for them. They can still continue to be professional players, but I don't see how that can be I don't think if you're building a strategy in terms of becoming a high performing team, that your strategy is to consistently take players who can't get game time elsewhere.
Final word on that from yourself, Garry, before we let you go. You've got a school run to do. But I guess if you look at, going back to, say, an Ulster pack, and if there are only 1 or 2 players from Ulster in it, and maybe I didn't express this clearly either, again, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that if you've a pack full of good players, but it is probably an indication that you aren't producing enough players on your own. And that is probably not quite sustainable for all of the reasons Bernard has outlined. And I think it's what Ferris was trying to get at as well, was that these are all fine players in their own right. They're given everything for the Ulster jersey. I don't think that can be questioned at all. But that it is probably, like, the fact that they are needed is a symptom of some shortcomings beneath the surface, if you know what I mean, that in a long-term sense will hold you back ultimately.
Yeah, well, I can't disagree with either the point you'd made or the point Bernard made on that. It is clear that Leinster's production line is just way superior to everybody else's in Ireland, and I don't think there's an easy answer to this, though, because the Leinster school system is different to every other school system in Ireland as well, and a lot of these players are being presented on a plate at 17, and albeit Leinster are doing a good job in developing thereafter, I don't know what the answer is, Gav, because you can't change the school system in Northern Ireland, and you can't. I suppose what you have to do then is start creating players a different way and come up, be inventive, and go to the clubs, go beyond the school system to help that out. But I don't have the answer at this moment in time.
Yeah, look, I think that's exactly what hasn't happened, because there's been that security blanket of tapping into someone else's resource. There hasn't been a massive focus and look at exactly what you have in your area. It doesn't have to. They can't copy Leinster. I 100% agree with you, Garry. The private school system is unique Leinster in terms of numbers and the level of investment that goes in there from the schools. But Munster had something very unique in Limerick that they've let slip away. Okay, and again, can they actually create a development pathway that's unique to Munster? Can Connacht do the same? Can Ulster do the same? And it doesn't matter how you get there as long as you get there. And in high performance, in elite sport, you can't keep going, oh, we don't have this, we don't have that. You just need to find the solution to help you win. And at the moment, I think it's too easy to tap into Leinster. And there has, for 5 or 6 years, I think we've taken our eye off the ball provincially, and whether that's the IRFU's fault or the provincial fault, in terms of the production line of local talent.
Gary, thanks a million. We'll let you go. Well, Bernard, on that very topic then about high performance and your reasoning that you can't continue talking about what you don't have. There has been a lot of discussion in the aftermath of Leinster's defeat in La Rochelle about budgets and resources at La Rochelle's disposal versus Leinster's. It went from Jerry Thornley saying that La Rochelle have, say, twice the budget of Leinster, or Leinster's is half their size or something along those lines, to Matt Williams talking about it being 3-4 times the size of what Leinster have. And it's already true, is it?
Yeah, I heard La Rochelle don't bother using towels in the showers; they use cash just to put in the. There's so much money. I find it unbelievable. I find it unbelievable that we're 20 years competing with the French in Europe, and some pundits or journalists actually still don't understand, or what, I don't know what, are they trying to protect RFU? I don't know why you would use a club's overall turnover as the budget for players. So the salary cap in France is 11.5 million, and it's very strict. It's incredibly strict. So there was probably a couple of clubs. Toulon back in the heyday, were rumoured to be breaking the cap, never got caught. We know Saracens broke the Premiership salary cap, but my understanding, speaking to agents and coaches and players there, is that it's pretty much accepted that no one's breaking at the moment. And there's clubs who want to break it, so clubs who have rich benefactors would love to break it to bring success, but they actually can't. It's not worth the risk. So 11.5 million would compare, I would say, very closely to what Leinster spend. We don't know for sure what the exact figure is, but if you sat down and worked out all the players they've contracted, I don't think you'd be a million miles away from that figure. So to say that we were beaten by a team who have twice the budget or 3 times the budget. So what teams do every year is they have to actually publish their budget and get it signed off by the LNR before the season starts, or else you don't get your license. So they have to show exactly where they're spending their money. And my budget in Grenoble was 3.8 million for players, and our overall budget, the one that people seem to think is a budget for players, was 19.8 million. Okay, so in terms of expenditure, everything that goes in and out of the club for a year was 19.8 million, but we were spending 3.8 on players. So we were way off the salary cap. The salary cap when I was there was about 9.5. And we would have known what we were competing with in terms of other clubs who were fighting for survival. Some of them would be spending 3.6, and some be spending 5, whatever. But the teams who were spending 8 and 9, they were up the top of the table, and the teams who spent under 5 were down the bottom. That's just the way it was. And that's the reality of it. So I don't think it's a financial issue. It's not. I think it's a case of how Leinster probably how they have to prioritise Irish players. And obviously Team Ireland is a huge focus, and we keep hearing everything's towards the national team, and this model is the best model in the world. Unfortunately, at the moment, I don't think the 4 provinces should be as reliant on that subsidy type mentality that you get from Team Ireland. So the money we get from the Six Nations goes back to the provinces. I think that the provinces aren't bad at actually generating their own revenue. They've all got good sponsors. They all have decent number of season ticket holders. They're all able to tap into the corporate market, etc. So they are way more self-reliant than the Welsh regions, for example, or the Scottish franchises or the Italian franchises. So I think it's important that they have a chance of being successful in their own right. And to be successful in their own right, I think they should have more autonomy around their recruitment and be able to put together a squad that's capable of winning whatever or getting to whatever level they want to get to. So if it's Connacht, if it's to qualify for Europe every year and get to a final or win a Pro 14, well, then it should be given within limits to the resources to do that, not just in terms of financial resources, but in terms of facilitation in terms of non-Irish qualified players, if that's what they need in a certain position. And if you look at Leinster, because we're talking about them and against La Rochelle, Leinster had 1 non-Irish qualified player in their squad this year in Scott Fardy. he was on the bench, so you had a fully Irish qualified team to start, and that's brilliant for Team Ireland. But you would have to say, I would have to say, it wasn't a help to Leinster in terms of trying to beat La Rochelle, who could call on an Argentinian hooker as a backup hooker, Liebenberg, Victor Vito, Carbarlo, Ohio West, Bottia. Both wingers were non-French, and obviously Antonio is someone who's played for France but was brought in as a project player quite young. So they and Will Skelton obviously is the name that everyone is thinking about as well. So they obviously helped the Brice Doulans, the Jules Plisson, the Gourdons, the Aldrites, be part of a historic day for La Rochelle, getting to the European Cup final, potentially winning one. And I think the effects of that can probably help La Rochelle, hopefully over the next 5 or 6 years, particularly under Rog, become a real force on a consistent basis in French and European rugby. As we want, I certainly want the Irish provinces to be that force in European rugby. And people will say, oh, Leinster, they had injuries. And they had injuries, and that definitely affected it. But I think when you look at... So 2009, we won... I'm going back to go forward. In 2008, we won the Magners League for Leinster. We had a very strong team. We had Malcolm O'Kelly, Keith Leeson, Jamie Heaslip was coming through, Brian O'Driscoll, Shane Horgan, Gervin Dempsey, etc., etc. We had a very good squad. And yet, the powers that be decided we were going to push for a European Cup. And we needed backup and we needed support. So they went out that summer and signed Rocky Elsom, Eason Asiwa, and CJ van der Linde, right? So, like, when those three guys walked into the dressing room in pre-season, we also had Felipe Condoponi and Chris Whitaker there at the time, two top-end internationals. Okay, I know Witt's captain Australia, he I don't know how many caps he had over 60 caps, I think, and a quality operator. And Felipe was a genius. And then we brought in three more. And we had Stan Wright as well. So we had 6, I would say, top-end guys who mixed in with what we had, gave us a fighting chance, and we won a European Cup. And then, obviously, Leinster signed, Rocky went back, they signed Nathan Hines, and he was good enough to be in the team every week, Scottish international. He played a big part in Leinster winning another European Cup, maybe 2. And then Brad Thorne for a season came in, a world-class player, and helped Leinster, I think, beat Ulster in that final. And I think since then, obviously, Ulster brought in Coetzee, which is a phenomenal sign. Ulster had Ruan Pinar. Connacht brought in Bundy at the time under Pat, and that was a big signing for them. Munster have obviously gone big with Delande and Snyman. And I admire them. I admire their ambition. And if I was a Munster player, I'd be absolutely delighted that they've done that, because they could be the point of difference in terms of helping them win silverware. So I think we've become way too strict on the foreign players and not understand how the benefit that can have in terms of helping our provinces overachieve or achieve their potential, and the influence that that can have on the team. And when they go to play for Ireland, the confidence you can have having won a European Cup, because at the moment, let's be honest, I don't think you would say the Irish team are high on confidence. Okay, and what's that coming from? Is it coming from, poor results at international level or inconsistent results at international level? Yeah, maybe, but also the fact that I think every dog in the street knows Leinster should win the European Cup, the Pro 14 every year. Anyway, because they spend the most depth, etc. But we haven't been able to win the European Cup since 2018 in Ireland, and I think that can affect losing to Saracens, losing to La Rochelle, can definitely affect the mindset of the players. And someone like James Ryan, right? So James Ryan's a top end player. He's obviously disappointed to miss out on the lines today. Can you imagine him playing alongside Will Skelton? How good would he be? No, but you know what I mean. And that's the challenge.
Well, this is going back to the game specifically, and selection is a completely different conversation. I'm aware I'm taking this on a brief tangent, but as soon as I saw Ryan starting alongside Toner, I thought that's not going to go well, purely because Ryan is warming his way back to form after relatively long-term absence, and Toner isn't the sort of dominant force you need next to you to ride on his coattails a little bit and start to build that confidence yourself, whereas if you are paired with somebody, look, Leinster don't have Will Skelton, but it just, from the off, that seemed a little bit off to me, and Ryan was fairly quiet. when you're you know yourself, like having played in a front row, but when you're playing in a unit, like as two locks, when the guy next to you is playing out of his skin, you're going to start playing out of your skin more than likely. Toner is an excellent player. He's been an unbelievable servant, but I didn't think it was the right game for him, and therefore Ryan suffered a little bit as a result. You know?
Yeah, and that's the reality of it at the highest level. One player who is, you know, past his best or struggling for form, can get, like, look, the opposition look for cracks, and they look for potential weaklings on the day, and they expose that, and that's the, like, I don't think Devon was the right call. I said it last week on the pod. I didn't think I would have started Fardy. I would have started Fardy, and even though his form isn't brilliant, I think he would have enjoyed that challenge, and he's physically stronger than Devon, even at the moment. So I think that was a mistake. And then I think when Reece Ruddock gets injured early, I think you bring on Fardy first. I think Ryan Baird is still learning his straps as a 6, and I think you keep him for impact later on. But look, those are decisions that are made in hindsight's 2020 vision. But I think as well, if you're only going to go with one non-Irish qualified, and you recontract someone like Scott Fardy, who has been phenomenal for Leinster and a brilliant signing, I think, and again, it's hindsight. I think you got to make sure when you recontract him, he's going to be good enough to start those big games, and he's going to give you something you can't get. This isn't about him. If you're only going to go for one foreigner, you take a risk, obviously, with injury. But if barring injury, they need to give you something different than you can get with your other 58 Irish qualified players, and that's probably something I'd say that they may, on reflection when they review it, maybe. And look, I can see why they would keep him, because he's been brilliant. But I think we're too light. We're too light on non-Irish qualified.
That was a miscalculation. Like, it happens, but let's call a spade a spade. If you have one non-Irish qualified guy who has been a talisman over the last couple of years, and you get to the most important game of your season, you don't feel as though he warrants a starting position in your team, then you've gotten it slightly wrong. It's no crime. Yeah, happens all the time. Everyone makes mistakes. But let's talk about it then from our point of view. You've mentioned a couple of times we're talking in hindsight, and I think that's important to stress as well. We've probably all miscalculated this a little bit, because if we're here criticising a lot of what Leinster are doing, and we're criticising kind of performance and macro stuff after the fact, then we have to accept that in advance of it, we didn't think we would be having this conversation, and maybe we overvalued a little bit of what Leinster were doing and didn't see these issues coming down the tracks. You know, like, we're not that we're culpable in it, but we are caught by surprise. So I don't think we're being overly critical in saying that Leinster should have seen it coming.
No, absolutely not. And the area that they got exposed against Saracens more than anything else in the Viva was the scrum. We saw signs that the scrum had improved, and obviously there was a key penalty just after half time, where La Rochelle got a second shove and they won a penalty. But in general, it wasn't the scrum that cost Leinster the game. It was the collision points, and, you know, defensively they couldn't stop La Rochelle on the gain line, and attacking wise they couldn't find any space. So and I would say the other part of how they'd be hard themselves in the review is that they didn't have a plan B to try and avoid, you know, those heavy collisions off 9, which worked for them in the Pro 14, and in fairness worked against Exeter. And Leinster probably too many Leinster players didn't perform on the day, but I think that we'd all agree there was a power deficit there, and it's the same power deficit that we saw against Saracens in Newcastle. We saw against Saracens to a lesser extent in the Viva, even though the scrum was the big weakness. And as pundits, we overcompensated for the Exeter win. We thought Leinster were too strong, and they weren't. Yeah, they weren't. And I think that looking at it now, and again, I think that the problem for Leinster is they invest so much in keeping that kind of mid layer strong. The guys who go out on a Friday night in November and put 40 on whoever in the Pro 14, which is they're often lots of internationals, right? So if you've been captain Ireland, you're going to be on a very good salary, and the problem is that they keep a lot of those, so their spend is being spread across a lot of numbers. So I would say if most teams, the top 20 get 60% of the salary, if you get me, and Leinster, I'd imagine it's being spread a lot further down into numbers because they lose so many players. So it's something that's unique to them. There's not many teams that contribute as many players to an international side. And with the whole funding model here, that does take up a lot of your budget. But also, I would say, and it's a risky tactic, but to not focus on being unbeaten in the Pro 14, and could you then use some of that budget to go and get those really high-profile match winners that can help you in the knockout stages of Pro 14 if you have to go into a semi-final to get into a final or whatever, and then obviously the latter stages of Europe, and they cost money, but they're invaluable. I mean, the reason those top-end players get paid so much is when the pressure's on, they come up with the goods. My point would be someone like Damien Gatland is a perfect example. You watch him, certain weeks in the Pro 14, and he's not the dominant player you would expect, but then when you get to knockout stages, World Cup finals, big must-win games for Munster, he has that ability to step up, and I just think Leinster probably lacking a little bit of that at the moment to add to the quality they already have.
So when you're looking at a squad of, say, nearly 60 players used during a season, whatever the final number was, do you think that Leinster maybe were blind to some of the things we were talking about? They obviously felt that was the right way to go. That's been what they've been trying to do for the last couple of years. Have this enormous squad, but layers of players upon whom you can rely in the Pro 14, and you hope then that there's a kind of a conveyor belt effect whereby establishing themselves in the Pro 14, they're ready for that step up to European competition. But just based on what we've seen against La Rochelle, based on those couple of Sarries games, maybe the answer is to go with a smaller squad. Like, I don't want to pick a number out of thin air, but focus more on a smaller nucleus of players. Bring in one or two guys that send you over the edge then from abroad, that give you that extra sprinkling of something that maybe some of the guys in that middle tier don't have. It's kind of delayering in a way, and that sounds kind of jarring when you're talking about people on contract and so on, but that maybe that is the way to take the next step for Leinster then.
Yeah, I look at it. It sounds incredibly harsh because their winning percentage is probably as high as any professional rugby team. But I do believe that the litmus test for Leinster is European cups. That's where they work so hard for. That's what they should be achieving. Not every year because it's incredibly difficult, but reasonably regularly. And as I said, they have the investment and they have the resources underneath, the pathways, etc., to do it. It's just a case of how you mix it up. And I also don't think it would be a bad thing for some of those youngsters to play in teams that maybe struggle in a domestic season now and again. I think they all look better than they actually are because of the whole cohesion they have and the overall level. And it's hard then to get a test of how good they are. And are they going to become match winners, or how are they going to deal with difficult situations? Kind of we highlighted about Ulster, that when the pressure comes on, they fold. We don't really get to see a lot of those young Leinster players under pressure much, although obviously the last couple of months they lost to Ospreys in the end, and they lost to Munster and Connacht, so that's a bit of a change. But in general, they've had it kind of all their own way, and I'm not sure that's the best way of finding out a lot about them. They say in terms of talent development that sometimes being stretched is an important part of the whole process rather than just coasting. So, it might not work out to be a bad thing, even though it's very hard to manufacture those type of situations.
One last one then on, say, prospective foreign signings or a marquee Rocky Elsom type guy. Obviously, Scott Fardy is going to be out of contract soon as well. And Stuart Lancaster was saying on Off the Ball, I think that it is an option to go after a kind of an Elsom type. We've seen, as you mentioned a few minutes ago, the other provinces do this, and there's probably an element of the IRFU feeling as though they needed to do it. Certainly from Munster's perspective, they want a challenge for trophies. They bring in 2 World Cup winners, 2 Springboks, and even in the off-season, just as we're in it at the moment, they've recruited Jason Jenkins, they've brought back Simon Zebo. Leinster are probably the team we've seen do it least. Do you think that is because of what we might now describe as an over-reliance or an overconfidence in what they were producing internally? Or do you think there were maybe difficulties in getting some moves past the RFU because they were deemed to be so successful in what they were doing? Like, there's surely not an aversion there to bringing in quality players, if you know what I mean. So I'm wondering why they've been less likely to do it.
Don't know. We're not. It's not transparent of whose fault it is. You would imagine, and this is complete guesswork, is that they may be allowed bring in foreigners, but then the downside of that is maybe they're then told to move somebody. I don't know, to move somebody on to make space because of the Team Ireland process. So that's all I can guess. I don't think Leinster would be adverse to bringing him in, for sure, especially if there's an area where there's a gap. Now, there's not many gaps. That's the problem. Like, you're talking about very good players. Leinster have a lot of very good players, but like, so I'd take Toulouse, for example. Toulouse and La Rochelle. So we spoke about La Rochelle a few minutes ago and their mix of players. Toulouse have traditionally had the best academy in Europe, in France, for 50 years. Really good community with all the local clubs, etc. Good coaching in the academy, a really good identity. They went and signed Antoine Dupont from Cast, okay, and they paid a big transfer fee to get him to come to Toulouse as a youngster and grow up with Emile Ntamak, who's came through their own academy. Even Toulouse have Charlie Faumina, tight head prop, two Arnold brothers, second rows, Jerome Kaino in the back row with Elstad in terms of their two foreign back rows, and then they've Peter Aki and Cheslin Colby. So now look, you could say, it's cyclical, and you don't need those type of players to get the finals, and maybe you don't, but I think that looking at Saracens, looking at Racing, looking at La Rochelle now, looking at Montpellier and Leicester, they both have those points of difference from outside their own pathways to help them push on, and I think maybe that's something that Leinster will look at and try and address.
Yeah, maybe you don't need them, but it kind of looks like you do. Pleasure as always, Bert.
Thank you.
Thank you to everybody at home as well. Bernard and I are going to stick around for a few minutes and chat about that line selection in a little bit more detail for the 42 members, members.the42.ie. If you want to join us there, support our independent sports journalism, get all of the extra podcasts, including Gavin Cooney's Behind the Lines and so many more. Until Monday, mind yourselves for members, and we'll be back again for non-members on Thursday. Take it easy.
I don't think we met before, but I'm the referee on this field.
Leinster could offer me $5 million a year, I wouldn't go.
It is Tommy Moe!
Rugby Weekly.
Little reverse pass.